Okay, guys. So looks like again we had a technical issue here. I'm very sorry about it, but if you want to watch the what I was talking about before that, you can watch it on Facebook. Or I'll ask our assistant to one of our colleagues to publish it on chess.com at the club. So for some reason I clicked to start the stream, but it didn't go well. Now it's working. So I didn't say anything specific. I was just explaining the strategy for white or for black. And we came to this position, which is taken from the game between Vladimir Kramnik and Garry Kasparov. Garry was known as an expert of King's Indian defense. And this is the moment where Garry Kasparov initiated a tactical strike. This tactical strike was mainly possible because of this move b3. Let me just repeat once again why b3 was played. So if a3, b4, and then trying to do c5, which is quite logical, black plays a4 with the idea of doing knight b3, or with the idea of doing en passant once b4 happens. So then if white allows black to get the pawn to a4, such so there will be no way to get rid of this knight. This is what I'm talking about. That's why Kramnik starts with b3, he wants then a3 and then b4. This eliminates the black's opportunity of playing a4 and exchanging the a pawn for the b pawn. So that's why b3 was played, and now black initiates a tactical strike. So which tactical strike I'm talking about? Okay. Ajedrez Canteras suggests g5. Well, g5, bishop g3, it's not a tactical strike. Then knight takes e4. How does it work? Oh, nice idea. So g5, bishop goes there, then you take, they take with the knight, you take this knight, they take with the other knight, then you play f5, trying to trap the bishop. Well, it's interesting, it does make sense. What happens after that? So maybe knight c3 or knight d2. Well, let's say, well, what is better to save? Well, f3 actually, f3, right? You have to take, and this position looks good for white. There is no attack on the king side for black anymore, and white can do c5 with the bishop. Maybe they play a3 before, so the position got simplified, and the white's plan becomes more clear. So g5 isn't actually, well, it is a tactical strike, but it's not a favorable tactical strike for black. Okay, any other suggestions? Okay, well, I wouldn't find it myself actually. Well, I would consider this option, but I wouldn't decide that it can be favorable for black. In blitz, it's definitely favorable for black. So here, Garry Kasparov plays this nice move, taking advantage of the attack of the bishop. For example, if now white takes the knight, then queen takes here, knight takes c5, d takes c5, and black has extra pawn. However, of course, white should capture the queen. This is exactly what happened. Knight c3, this is a fork, and white should save the queen, otherwise they lose a few pieces. So queen e1, rook f d8. And now we came to the position where black has two minor pieces and one pawn in order to compensate the queen. Well, it's definitely not enough, you may think. And yes, that's absolutely right. It's not enough. The other factor that we should take into account is the black's pieces coordination. So with two minor pieces and the pawn, but because of better pieces coordination and because of joining this bishop to the game, black gets more compensation than you may think originally. Well, actually, one thing that you may remember about such a bishop, which is usually bad, it's absolutely blocked. Sometimes black uses it by locating its own f8 in order to support the pawn on d6, which is attacked with c5. However, I want you to understand that once you are able to join the dark squared bishop to the game, you are likely to get a winning position with black pieces. So, well, what white should do? White's task is to stop this initiative, to somehow try to simplify the position. And the best thing that they could do was actually knight b1. So this knight is active. It's important to exchange it. For example, knight e2, queen e2. Here you may say, what about e4? Then the rook is lost. Well, not the rook, but the exchange. That is not a big issue. Knight c2. Yes, there is a full compensation for the queen, rook, bishop, and the pawn, but no initiative anymore, and the position becomes equal. So if this move, then just knight a3 and knight goes to c2 or to b5, rook d1, and again, looks like there is no initiative for black anymore. But in the game it was rook c1. By the first glance this is a tempo gaining move, but they sacrifice the other pawn, and then the knight goes to a better spot. Again, creating some extra threat. Bishop d1, e4, rook goes to b1, and rook e8 was played. Another thing you may consider here is bishop d4, which is actually a good move and maybe even better than the one that Garry Kasparov played. And if, for example, here white decides to take on e4, what happens with their position? Who can tell me? Yeah, so these two pieces for a queen sacrifice by the first glance is definitely not enough. And I'm not sure that I would initiate such a sacrifice in a real long game, but I would probably could do it in a blitz game. However, Garry Kasparov is such an expert in King's Indian defense, so he knows all these features, and he understands that pieces activity may play a more significant role in this type of the position rather than material advantage. Okay, so, well, if this move, well, yeah, first of all, knight e4, queen takes e4, bishop f5, and this is a skewer. But there is no initiative again. So you have enough compensation, rook, knight, and a rook and the knight, one pawn, and just to compensate the queen, well, yes, but where is your initiative? No initiative. Instead, you can play better. Instead of taking here, you may play rook e1. And there is no way of playing f3 because the pawn is pinned. Okay, let's go back. So instead, rook e8 was played by Garry, queen e3, and f5. With the idea of doing g5, f4. So this is the main plan of black in King's Indian defense. And if this plan allows black to activate the bishop, then black has one extra piece into the attack. And the attack is likely to be successful. So h4, some prophylaxis, but rook f8, no rush. It's better to locate the rooks properly and continue the attack. g3, rook a e8, king g2, and this knight goes back to the center in order to support f4 move. So rook g1, f4, pawn takes, rook takes. Well, it was possible to take with the knight, but with the rook you are taking here. So h5, trying to open the position of the black king, maybe also activate some pieces. But g5, so this king is in a danger, this king is relatively safe. And one more thing, actually, what you should remember, when you play with a queen against some other material, so it's a kind of imbalanced position, where you have a queen, your opponent has a compensation for the queen, the most important thing is to try to take advantage of the weakness of the enemy king. If the king is not weak, then you should weaken it by doing such moves like h5. If you are able to expose the enemy king, then the power of your queen increases. This is what not everyone knows, but this is what you can learn in practice. So let's say, for example, I was showing my game. Let me show it once again. I was showing my game against Grandmaster Ariel Sorin. So this is the game I was talking about. And okay, let's quickly skip this part. So I was able to end up with extra exchange in this position. And how do I take advantage of my queen activity? Queen and rook coordination. So they also have a queen, but with a knight and the queen, they are unlikely to challenge my king. So, and my task here in order to win the game is not just to exchange the queens, pass the game into the winning game, because such an endgame may be not winning. How do I attack his weaknesses? There is a knight protecting them, and a4 is always hanging. So here I play f6 in order to expose the king. Knight takes a4, queen e5, because my knight was hanging. Then this. And instead of trying to capture his weaknesses on the other flank, I am focused on the king side attack. Queen f6, threatening with rook g4. And then I started taking his weaknesses. So f6. Well, the game wasn't over, actually. The game wasn't over here. I think it wasn't even f6. It was f5, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, it was not f6 but f5. I played after f5 I played queen c4 and took the pawn on a4, but the main idea was to take advantage of the king weakness. It wasn't weak at the very beginning, but with f6 I could expose it. Okay, now let's continue with the game of Garry Kasparov. So g5, rook f1 and rook h4, threatening with bishop h3 move, but rook h1, and they repeated the position, and finally Garry decided to double. f3 was played, because if not this, then bishop e2, let's say, then rook h4, bishop h3 is still a threat, and here knight f4, let's say, and here even bishop d4 is enough. The queen just has no squares. It's a fork every time. But f3. So Kramnik is doing actually a right thing. He tries to open the position, simplify it, and exchange pieces. Because if, let's say, you have two minor pieces and the pawn against the queen and no other pieces, you are unlikely to win the game. Moreover, you can even lose it. Well, most likely you will draw it, but there is a chance to lose. But with better pieces coordination, so these pieces are much better than this. So this rook and the queen are still doing some stuff, but the knight, the bishop, and especially the rook on b1 are quite passive. So rook h4, f takes a4, and knight f4, starting a mating attack. King goes there, then the other knight joins the game, and after e5, well, what else to suggest, because bishop e5 is coming. So e5, knight takes e5. rook goes to c1, and there is nothing to talk about. So the queen was gained back. Now the material is, well, the number of pieces is equal. Black is 2 pawns up. Knight h3 check. The rooks are exchanged, and actually, even without these pawns, it's a completely winning position because of a mating net that Garry Kasparov creates. So knight f4, and there is a checkmate in 7 moves. So this is where Kramnik resigned, but the game could be continued like that. And then this move with the idea of doing several things. This, well, it's up to you. So probably bishop d4 is the main threat, and then the queen is promoted. The pawn is promoted to the queen. This is what I wanted to say. So what you may remember from this game. From this game, you may also learn about a queen sacrifice, which definitely will lead to a kind of a misunderstanding of the position from your opponent. He gonna get into trouble anyway because he won't be familiar, and he would overestimate his position, considering that the queen is a lot and the 2 minor pieces in the pawn doesn't cost the queen, but probably he would misunderstood such a factor as pieces coordination. So if you can compensate your material losses with better pieces activity, it is enough, especially in such a opening, in such a structure where your task is to initiate the attack on the enemy king. It's always risky when your pieces are coordinated. Okay, so that was the tactical strike, which was found by Garry Kasparov. Maybe it was his home preparation, maybe he found it during the game, which I doubt. I think he knew these ideas and he was just about to evaluate how his pieces are good in this exact position. The second game that I would like to demonstrate is the game played by my friend who was also teaching me chess in 2019 when I became a FIDE master. So it's Grandmaster Dmitry Bachurov who was playing with white pieces in this game. However, that time he was not a Grandmaster, just a master. And I think at that period I also defeated him a few times. Okay, well, let's start. Here, white decided to fianchetto their light squared bishop, which is quite a common strategy against King's Indian defense. This setup is considered to be quite strong when you are about to get attacked on the king side. So, for example, this setup is very common against Dutch defense with f5 move. Okay, d6, castle, knight c6. So knight c6 looks kind of a suspicious move, to be honest. Okay, guys, so this stream is now available at ChessLands as well as on YouTube. So if you experience any problems with YouTube, go back to ChessLands. It's also available on Twitch. Okay, so Paul suggests rook e8, which I think is a good idea instead of knight c6. Or maybe you're not talking about this position. Okay, anyway. Well, this move looks suspicious. I would say maybe c6, knight d7, and then e5. That would be my plan. What I don't like this move, because if the knight goes to e5, this bishop is blocked after the exchange. Well, in the game it was knight c6, knight c3, a6, and then d5 was played. And now the knight goes to a5. And here b3 doesn't look bad. b3 is good. Well, typically when b3 is played in such positions, you may see such ideas like knight d5 or knight e4 with the main idea of taking advantage of this pin. But here, let's say knight e4 doesn't work. What's wrong with this move? Who can tell me? white ends up with extra material. So John is absolutely correct. So knight takes e4, bishop takes rook. Looks like while black has extra exchange, but after such move like bishop d2, it's actually a double attack. And white is about to get two minor pieces for a rook, which is definitely favorable for them. Well, here Dmitry plays knight d2 instead of doing b3. Black plays another variation of King's Indian defense, which actually I like myself and some of my students played. It's c5, Yugoslav variation of King's Indian defense. Well, not e5 to not blocking the bishop, but c5. And usually when such a move is played, the key idea is to try to play on these squares, maybe also do this attack and try to get the control over the b file. But it doesn't mean that the attack on the enemy king is not possible anymore. It is. So queen c2, rook b8, b3 was played. So here white protected on c3. That was the reason of queen c2. b5, bishop b2, h5 as a prophylaxis, and with the idea to play h4, which is also quite common in order to expose the king. Well, this is a very common plan against the kingside fiancetta. And white is doing everything perfectly well until a certain moment of the game. They play rook e1 because if they do this, they win the game, right? Well, this pawn structure is quite preferable for black, for white, because with two pawns in the center, especially already on the enemy territory, so on the fifth rank, e5 and d5, white is likely to control everything, the center, and provide their pieces with several squares in the center to maneuver. For example, e4. This knight or the other knight can go to e4. So this is the main plan. Bishop f5, e4 with a tempo, bishop d7. Knight goes to d1. And this is where black realizes that f4, e5 is coming, or even e4 directly, and they play e5 themselves. How would you play for white in this position? What do you think? So knight takes e4. No, knight takes e4 when? So now the question is how to play for white. So it's not knight e4, of course. b4. Well, b4 is interesting, but c takes b4. What then? c5? Okay, maybe. What if I... Okay, b4 I have to take. Then you do c5 and I probably take it again. So well, bishop e5, rook goes here. So I don't think, well, we can make these moves on the board if you want. b4. Then, well, knight c4 is also attractive. Yeah, knight c4 looks good. Knight c4, for example, knight takes, pawn takes. So if you take, it's bishop b5, of course. So take here. And it seems that white is fine after bishop e5. But I think that after b4 it's better to take here, and after c5 is played, take, bishop e5 and just rook c8. So I don't think that white has any advantage. These pawns are quite strong. The bishop should retreat and e5 should be played, but knight c4, knight g4 also to stop it. So if black wants to close the center, white should try to undermine it and obtain more ideas because of that. So f4. B takes c4, b takes c4, and now h4 trying to undermine. That was a really clever move, and there were several ways for white to stop it. For example, white could just play bishop c3, taking the control over this knight. Well, if the knight goes back to b7, then all these pieces are ugly. And now with bishop attacking the knight, it means that the queen cannot join the attack anymore because the knight will be hanging every time. Another thing white could do was f5 to close the position on the king side, and the attack on the king side will be a bit tougher for black. For example, bishop h6, bishop c3, h takes g3, h takes g3, and looks like black pieces are stuck. It's not easy to find how exactly to continue the attack. Well, white played f takes e5, which looks logical, but is a mistake. When that happens, you take advantage of your bishop being fianchetted. So what do you think? What's the best move for black in this position? How do we take advantage of our bishop? Because activating this bishop is the key. Well, sometimes you can checkmate without this bishop, and that happens quite often in King's Indian defense. But if you can activate the bishop, you are likely to win the game. And if you see a possibility of doing it, activate it, even sometimes at the cost of one pawn. So, knight h5 suggested by Brian. Well, yeah, the idea is good. You're pressuring here, but I think black found a better move. What other suggestions do we have? Nothing else? Okay, not knight h5, but knight g4, threatening to take on h2, which is more important. Knight g4, right? This is exactly what happened. So here, for example, e6, breaking some coordination among enemy pieces would be a good idea for white, but they took on d6. And yes, this tactical strike is coming because this bishop is better than a rook, because this bishop is able to provide with more provide black with more activity. Bishop checks, and if you want, you can always gain the exchange back with these two moves, knight f2 or knight e3, because knight f2 they have to take. I doubt that they will tolerate these. Let me show you. So knight f2 they have to take. If they do not take, you can take here. Then you can go back and do something else, maybe play knight d3 and take on b2. That's why every time you play knight f2, they have to sacrifice the exchange. But black doesn't want to gain the exchange. Black wants to succeed with a checkmate. And what do you think? Which move black played in this game? Okay. So John is absolutely correct. It's knight h2. Well, h takes g3 was also possible, but then h3, closing the position. However, it's still fine. Knight f2, rook takes, pawn takes, rook f1. and bishop g4, trying to do this, because if they take, this is a checkmate. So h takes g3 was also possible, but knight h2, another strong move, was played in the game. Now if the king takes, the game is over. Check. If the king goes back, this leads to a checkmate. If the king takes on g3, queen g5, and then the queen goes to the h file, it's also a checkmate. So that's why white just cannot take this knight. They have to bring more pieces to defend their position. Knight f3. Well, this is where black started making mistakes, and that's the reason why black lost the game. However, it's absolutely winning for black, and mainly because of their pieces. The knight, the bishop, and this queen, which is ready to join the place of action at any moment. So black played knight f1 move, gaining the exchange back, trying to capture on g3 or the next move, and they thought that this position is favorable for them, which is true, but it's not as good as it could be. So what's the best move for black here? H takes g3 and knight takes f3. Well, let's talk about knight takes f3. Knight takes f3, rook takes f3, and if you take, they take with the rook. Then you still check. Okay, maybe they, in such a case, they take with the bishop, and if you take, queen h4 is a threat. Is there anything that they can do to stop it? Yes, they can play this move, and once you play this, they play that. So, and something like king g7, let's say king g2, king h7, king g7, sorry, rook h1, yeah, still doesn't make sense for black. Okay, so taking on f3 isn't good, but taking on g3 right now works really well, because if now knight takes here, it's just queen h4, threatening to take with a mate, so they have to find how to defend the position, maybe with this move. After which there shouldn't be any rush. Well, for example, you could continue with this move. The rook moves, maybe. Then you take, the queen takes. Well, bishop f5, and then you move the bishop to f1, which leads to a checkmate. Okay, good. So that's why the knight cannot be taken on h2. And they probably have to take on d4 instead. But then queen h4 with a checkmate on the next move. So king g1, c takes d4, and so this knight comes to g4, let's say, and queen h2 is a mate. Or maybe knight takes f1. So they have to play rook f3 or something like that in order to liquidate the pawn or to let the king escape in case of queen h2. But knight f3, bishop takes f3, and just d3 in this position. The queen cannot be distracted, so because of a checkmate, the knight has to take, but once the knight takes, it's knight takes e4, and again this knight goes to the game, but the queen cannot be distracted. So queen g2, knight takes d6, and this is the main threat, so black is likely to win the game soon. Okay, so knight takes f1 was played. Bishop takes, h takes g3, knight takes d4, check on h4, king goes there, and this is where black made another mistake, this time the most significant one. Of course, the most simplest way of how to convert your advantage is to take on d4, and after queen g2, let's say, to stop g2 move, rook b8, knight tries to go to d1, Then maybe knight b7, e5, knight c5. Yeah, black should be winning in this position. With their pieces activity, they can, I'm sure they can succeed, because e6 cannot be played. It's a blunder. I mean, f takes, d takes, bishop takes at least. And black is threatening with this move. And then maybe bishop g4 or queen to g4, trying to take advantage of the pin. So it's really hard to defend. But in the game, black played this move, g2, which seems to be a logical idea to attack the rook and to threaten the bishop, but knight f3 with a temper. Of course, they take on f1, promote to rook. Why do they promote to a rook? Because there is no big difference. This piece will be captured anyway. It's important to deliver a check, so either a queen or a rook can deliver a check. But this game was played in Novosibirsk in a local club, and at that times there were no extra queens near the board. And instead of trying to find the queen, black decided just to promote to a rook, which does the same thing. Rook takes f1. So if they promote to a queen, it's still rook takes f1. So black just decided to not go somewhere else, to look for a queen, not to call the arbiter, but to promote to a rook. And again, here queen h5 could be more favorable. Queen h5, e5, and bishop h3. And maybe there is a perpetual check, but black tried to make mistakes. Queen f4. Queen d2, trying to exchange. Queen g3, queen f4, e5. Bishop g4 is another mistake. Instead, they'd better capture on c4. Take, e6, take on d5. Well, what else? Because if pawn takes, it's queen g6. So e6, queen takes, pawn takes, but queen d6. And this pawn is likely to die. So white has an extra knight, but with such a king being exposed, I'm not sure if white wins here. However, after bishop f4, yes, white wins. Knight h2, bishop d4, queen f2, and you just cannot stop these three pawns. I don't think that the rest of the game is interesting. White just converted their advantage and won the game quite quickly. So we don't need to analyze it. These pawns are weaknesses. For example, knight a4 and knight takes c5 is just possible. Well, rook invasion is also a good plan. So finally, e7, check. And now this knight has to be activated, but actually there is no reason. For example, d6 and d7 is enough. f4. And after d7 it's over. So why it's over? Because of d8 coming, and if this move it's still d8, which is a double check, so they have to take with the queen, and after this move they lose their rook. That's the reason after d7 here black resigned. So but you see, black had a winning attack. They were just not as good as, for example, Garry Kasparov was in order to find the best continuation. So this idea is quite common, but from this game I want you to remember the sacrifice of the rook on b2. So activate your bishop, get rid of his opponent, the dark square bishop of white, and join your bishop to the game with bishop d4, trying to bring more pieces to the king side, especially your queen. And with this check, the enemy king is stuck on the h file, so it's quite easy to checkmate. For example, h takes g3, and you can take and bring the queen, or if this knight moves, you bring the queen immediately. Okay, fine, we are done, and we have one more game example, which is a very short game between Maxim Vashyalagraf and Alexander Grishchuk. So you see, I'm trying to talk about three different structures which may happen in King's Indian defense. Of course, we could even do 10 hours course devoted to this topic, but today I try to talk about everything in this 1 hour webinar. So first of all, we were talking about the most natural Sicilian with e5 and d5, so this pawn structure. Second, we were talking about Yugoslav variation and the fianchetto from white. So c5 was played instead of e5, but the bishop was fianchetted, which usually makes the king stronger. Second, we are going to talk about the exchange variation of king's Indian defense. So the move order was a bit different, but it finally led to king's Indian defense after e5. E4 was played. So, well, exchange variation is actually d takes e5, d takes e5, but e takes d4 is also quite common. So, for example, once I was playing it with black, but that wasn't a good idea actually, and I was able to win the game, but again, not because of the opening. So here, knight takes d4, of course. Knight c5. c5 is a good spot for the knight. Rook comes to e1. Maxim Vashyalagraf was playing with white pieces, so he was. It was a rapid game, if I'm not mistaken. Let me. No, it was a blitz game with 5 minutes plus 2 seconds. And he was playing against Alexander Grishchuk, so both players are quite experienced in King's Indian defense and other openings and know a lot. So here, Grishchuk plays knight g4 move. Knight g4 contains the idea of activating the bishop, pressuring here, so for example, this can be a threat, maybe the queen to b6, knight e6 and something like that. I tried to exploit a similar idea in my recent Sicilian game, but I failed with it and win because of a different strategy. So this move, so for example, if h3, which is the most natural thing, queen f6, double attack. John, at which moment h5 was necessary? Okay, so queen f6, for example, what they can do? They can play knight f3, but if knight f3 is played, then it's knight e5 looks good, and after knight e5, d takes e5 looks like these pieces are good, only the bishop requires improvement, but this bishop will be bad for the whole game, I think. So black is even slightly better here. And if, for example, after queen f6 they take here, we take on d4, the queens are exchanged, and this position is relatively fine. So f3. Why f3? Why not, for example, to capture on d6? Well, I don't think there is a point, because d6 is a weakness, and after the rook has to go, it's bishop g4. So white doesn't gain a pawn with rook d6. It's just an exchange. So it's better to let black to play with the weakness on d6, but with f3. Well, yeah, sometimes a5 is necessary, sometimes b4 is a weakness. Well, I'll explain it. Okay, now I'll answer the question from Brian. They would take the knight first. No? Which knight? Wait a sec. So h3, queen f6, h takes g4, queen takes d4. Which knight? Or maybe you're talking about this, knight e5. No, if they take the knight first, you take on d4. This, take. No, it's fine. Okay, so yeah, well, usually this knight has to be secured, and this is how Maxim Vashyalagraf thought at that moment, and that's the reason why he played before. So now the question for you, which tactical strike black is able to initiate in this position? Okay, guys, I'm waiting for your suggestions. So, no suggestions? Okay. That was the... Okay. Uh-huh. What do you... Okay. Just a sec. So, knight g4. Okay, b4, knight e5 is the suggestion. Pawn takes knight c4. This is probably you want. Okay, let's take a look at this line. So, knight c4. What happens then? This is hanging. So, most likely they move it back. D takes c5, knight e2. So, it looks okay for white. White doesn't lose any pieces. So, queen e5, queen b3, let's say. But, well, how? Let's say you do this, I play, I don't know, this move. You play b4. You play b4. Oh, the knight is hanging. What are we talking about? So, yeah, this b5 is obligatory. Then the bishop goes, let's say, to f4. And b4 is not possible because of queen takes c4. No, there is another move that Grishuk played. Grishuk played queen b6. What does this move do? So it creates a pin. That's why something like that is not favorable. Two knights are now in danger. So this knight moves its bishop c3. This knight moves its what? D takes c4 probably. Yeah, this knight moves its d takes here. D takes c5, I mean. Rook b1. And how you may continue. Maybe just queen e2 is enough. Because the number of pieces is equal, you just capture 2 pawns for nothing. And maybe you also capture the pawn on c4. So queen b6, a3 was played. a5. Trying to take advantage of this pin. Now what? Well, here Maxim Vashyalagraf decided that knight e2 may work, but that was another mistake. Instead, he could try with this move. A takes b4, a takes b4, rook a1, bishop a1, and queen takes b4. Well, he cannot take on d6, because if he does, it would be something like that. Take, queen takes, bishop d4, and queen e8 doesn't look good, because even if the queen takes there, it's still bishop takes c3. And now there is a... Maybe there is a better move here. Yeah, for example, check. If king goes there, it's queen c4. And they are in trouble. Oh, this is a check, actually. Okay, just 95, let's say. The pawn is stopped and everything is hanging. And after, well, after the knight moves, it's queen b1. And with 2 knights, black is able to stop the pawn on d7. So e5, a takes b4, a takes b4, rook a1, bishop takes. So e takes, well, h3 maybe, but then knight e5. And after f4, this knight goes to d4, because if they take here, then this, and maybe rook e5. Well, it's obvious that black is better here. Black has a rook for 2 minor pieces, but together with the rook, there are 3 pawns. Black is definitely winning. Okay, knight e2 was played. A takes b4, a takes b4. And how would you play in this position? The move is quite obvious. After the next move, white resigned. Can you imagine it? Maxim Vashyalagraf, one of, well, his in top 10. Well, it was a blitz game, but he resigned in this position because he simply got trapped. And he got trapped because he overestimated the b4 move. So what are your suggestions, guys? Does 96 work? Well, no, I don't think so. 96. So this is the idea. But let's check. So 96. Then let's say bishop takes bishop. No. Queen f2, or maybe even knight f2. What is better? Okay, so knight e6 taken with the knight is definitely a mistake, but maybe c5 can be played. D takes c5 and maybe knight e6 in this position. Yeah, knight e6 seems to be reasonable. Yeah, black is winning here. Yeah, knight e6 works. Right, thank you for this suggestion. But there was a better move played. No audio? Let me check. No, it's working. Yes, everything is working. I'm sure you can hear me well. Can you check your audio? Knight b3. Well, knight b3 seems to be another interesting move. Brian is absolutely correct. It's knight a4. So knight a4 is probably the strongest continuation here. Knight a4, and you don't need to sacrifice anything. How do they solve this problem? And once you get rid of it, you can take on d4. So let's say they even do this. Pawn takes. Pawn takes queen b2. What are we talking about? A completely winning position. This, and this is hanging. So let's say knight e2, queen takes a1, supported by a bishop. So knight a4, and simply Maxim Vashyalagraf just resigned because he couldn't do anything. Even if he tries to save it, after the exchange he loses the knight on d4. That's why, yes, the position of the knight on c5 should be secured with a5. But if you see that after b4 with too many threats you can benefit, then instead do not play a5. Try to provoke your opponent to play b4, like happened in this game. Okay, so today we talked about 3 different types of the position in King's Indian defense, and I illustrated 3 different games, and I think the most representative is this one played by Garry Kasparov, because this is the most common scenario. After bishop g5, just remember that you have an opportunity of this sacrifice. If, for example, this sacrifice didn't work, you could consider queen e8, knight h7, f5, which is another typical strategy. Okay, so what do you think we should do at our next webinar? So maybe today there are just few people. Usually we have about 20 or 40 people, but this time it's about I think 10, which is quite low for us. And that's why I would like to talk about the topic of the next webinar. So as you remember, I have several years, so I can also do the webinar about tactics in Benoni defense. Another topic is the king defense itself, how to play Sicilian against Carey's attack, Caro-Kann with the advanced variation of Caro-Kann for black, and play like Firouzja, yeah. So you can also know these guys, Firuza Alireza. Well, he's probably the best under, well, yeah, let's look at his FIDE profile. So this guy, yes, Alireza Firouzja, best junior. And what else? Well, I think that's it. This is the topics I prepared. If you have anything else in mind, I also can teach how to play positionally against King's Indian, but it's unlikely to be the next webinar. Well, maybe king defense itself, that would be the topic of our next webinar. But if you have any other suggestion, okay. So a good suggestion from Brian: finding a draw in a losing position. Well, okay, so saving losing endgames, something like that. Yeah, okay, let me think about it. Okay, audio is working, perfect. Okay, guys, so that's all for today. So next weekend, I hope there will be more people. Maybe there is something wrong with announcements this time, and there was a technical issue, so unfortunately again we didn't start in time. And if you want to watch this webinar from the beginning to the end, I'm going to publish it inside our class on chess.com, inside our club on chess.com. For example, let me show you where exactly. So this is my profile, and you can actually send me a friend request. But this is Chessland's club, and so this is our announcement. So inside this announcement there will be a video. So here, instead of this text, I'll add a video that you can watch again from the beginning to the very end. Okay, so anyway, send me friend request, join our group at chess.com, and see you next weekend.